It was October the 3rd, as the proverbial storm clouds were gathering across the vast majority of North America, as the previously scheduled Chinese and Russian naval drills were going on off of both coasts of the country. Their external invasion components were assembling already within Mexico, headed for their jumping off points to begin the invasion at midnight, just at the exact point where the tandem Sino-Russian anti-satellite attacks were to be underway, as well as the great cyber attack in tandem with it. As both China and Russia possessed satellite dazing technologies, wherein they could blind orbiting satellites hovering over different areas, they opted to deploy these specific technologies to block any sight of Mexico as well as Canada, as the vast majority of the external components were gathered there to prepare to conduct their various invasion prongs deep into the nation, and rapidly so, in order to race inland and assist the Trojan shock armies that were to be already deep inside the nation, carrying out their various lightning strikes against their specifically assigned objectives pertaining to every unit and every unit's subunits, and all the way down the line to even the company level at the lowest. As every Trojan shock unit of the Trojan components, separate from the externals who began in the neighboring nations, the Trojan shock forces themselves were arrayed on a myriad of CCP regime properties, having been purchased for many decades, along with many of the port facilities, including some of America's largest ports owned by the Red Chinese, including Long Beach Port, the largest single port on the West Coast, among many others. As these ports were used over the decades, from the early 2000s and even late 90s, to haul in the enormous quantity of invasion-related logistics, vehicles, and weaponry for this very day. As this was a carefully pieced together plan involving a handful of nations, with others joining as the time drew near. As China, the sole world superpower in real terms, was the de facto coalition leader, along with Russia, the number 2 overall power in real terms. As many often called America a superpower, this was actually not in fact true, as this was a nation struggling to produce various munitions, having to pull engineers out of retirement, not graduating professionals in the sciences and math-related fields anywhere near what Russia and especially China were turning out of their universities. This translated to greater levels of production and innovation in both nations, which is why China and even Russia had surpassed the United States. The Great Proxy War in Eastern Europe was further proof of this, as the entire collective West struggled to even come near Russian shell production, which alone was 7 times greater than that of the entire NATO alliance at the time. China was on a completely different level than any other nation on Earth, industrially speaking, conventional military-wise, economically, industrially, and even in terms of raw wealth, having the largest single gold holdings in the entire world to boot. The Chinese had the largest forces under arms of any nation on Earth when combining their massive 20 million strong paramilitary forces with all their various branches to the active PLA military forces and their large ready reserve force of 5 million additional troops, all having had been mobilized for this very day, and many even stationed within the land to be invaded America. These forces were arrayed on various different types of CCP regime properties, including many farms and ranches where they could hide entire battalions beneath rows of greenhouses with green tarp beneath to camouflage the vehicles from aerial view, as well as barns and pole barns, large sheds, even secret underground areas that had been dug and turned into de facto garage-type structures. These forces were now activating their phone chains and calling in their troops to conduct accountability formations and then briefing formations, as well as vehicle maintenance, as in pre-maintenance services and checks and fueling and arming, to make sure they were green on everything. Green on ammunition, green on fuel, green on food and water, green on maintenance, as in everything ready to go at a moment's notice. Many of these Trojans, starting mere miles from their objectives, literally took under 2 hours to arrive at most of their objectives, some far sooner. As the invasion broke out, all of the tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile forces involved, including one even as a Trojan unit, the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade from the Eastern Theater Command of China, in addition to the 612th and 613th, as well as allied units from both Pakistan and even from Iran, and Russia's own tactical ballistic missile unit, the 950th Rocket Brigade within the 2nd Combined Arms Army, all readied their forces for their various strike missions. Club Ks would play a major role in this invasion. Club Ks, or their analogous YJ-18C cousins, which are essentially the same type of platform, a 4 cruise missile based supersonic, as in past subsonic but not hypersonic, but supersonic, breaking the sound barrier, cruise missiles, 4 apiece, with a fairly moderate range. And these would be timed to go off in salvos for hours in order to keep missiles flying in the air, more as a way to shatter the morale of the enemies and keep them guessing on which targets would be struck next, as they had totally lost their ISR capabilities, their ability to communicate, and general overall situational awareness as a whole, as this invasion would be a shock to their very senses, as Trojan shock forces would be literally everywhere, seemingly coming out of every crack and crevice, as they began within the land itself, with the externals merely crossing the border in great strength to act as their heavy-handed reinforcements racing deep inland before fanning out to aid other Trojans as it pertained to the external forces. Their Trojan brethren, meanwhile, would be busy doing the heavy lifting, capturing cities, key infrastructures, key routes of invasion, key population centers, and more, and resources as well. The 77th PLA Group Army was tasked with subduing 2 military installations at the same time, one being in North Texas, the Sheppard Air Force Base, a training air base, but nonetheless still of importance, as it boasted certain aircraft that were capable of supersonic flight, being the T-38Cs, which the Talons were a jet aircraft, although they also had the Texan IIs, which were a prop plane, although not as much of a threat. If there was a way they could be armed at a later time, they could prove as a potential thorn in the side of occupiers, should they even ever be permitted to take off from anywhere, loaded with anything, Hence, the reason why Trojans began very close to installations in order to rapidly subdue them and not even give them the chance to do anything remotely similar to this. The air power afforded to all the ground forces was immense, with the largest air armada ever assembled at any one place at one time, with more aircraft involved than even during the Operation Barbarossa, which up until this invasion will have still been the largest invasion in human history. Although in the terms of the land power involved in this invasion, the entire invasion of the United States was 3 times larger in terms of the ground forces involved at 12.5 million, with many more vehicles, artillery, and armor available for this invasion, as well as logistical trains and trucks. These forces were immense. 5 million Trojans within the land spread all throughout it, many of them Chinese Army and paramilitary, and as far as the PLA, PAP, and National Militia Forces, among some others. And the next biggest contributor being Russia at an overall 2 million Trojans, as well as some externals. The other 500,000 being a mix of their smaller allies. By smaller, it goes from moderate size to smallest size in terms of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 nations involved in terms of their overall military power. There were some other very powerful nations involved, such as Pakistan, a very tight ally of China, as well as also North Korea, another key ally of China, and Russia as well, and also Belarus, a strong Russian ally, and also Iran, an ally of both Russia and China, and many smaller nations. These nations and their total accumulated firepower was enormous, to say the least. And the 77th Group Army, being a regular PLA force, was armed with all the latest and greatest in terms of military technology, with their artillery fielding the longest range artillery system in operation, the A300 rocket system, a 300 millimeter extended range rocket with a much longer engine than the PHL-03 rockets, which were also 300 millimeter. This system had a 187 mile range and could, from its area outside of Fort Sill in lower Oklahoma, as this Trojan unit, the 77th, was responsible for subduing both installations, could fire to aid their forces in North Texas, or even fire to aid another group army, the 58th, in Oklahoma City, due to the immense range that these possessed. They were also armed with the newest 122 millimeter rocket artillery, the armored PHL-11s, as well as the Type 83 152 millimeter self-propelled guns in their armored forces, as well as the PLZ-05 155 millimeter self-propelled guns in their armored forces. They also had the newest towed howitzer, an AH-4 towed howitzer, a very light 155 millimeter, very portable howitzer. The mountain version was the AHS-4, which was only 6,614 pounds total and very light and easy to transport. These armed the mountain units of the 77th Group Army and its artillery. The tank forces were the latest and greatest, as the Type 99A, the most advanced battle tank on Earth potentially, as well as the Type 15 arming the mountain units' light tank battalions, as well as the very advanced ZBD-04A IFVs and the newest VN-20 IFV, a brand new IFV, which was now beginning to be produced in decent numbers as new batches were being steadily churned out in previous years. The helicopter forces of the Aviation Brigade included Z-10 attack helicopters, one of China's latest and greatest in rotary aviation, as well as the heavily armed Z-11WA armed reconnaissance helicopters equipping the recon battalions, and Z-20 utility helicopters, the newest utility helicopter. Air defense artillery consisted of the SPAAA-95s for close-in air defense for the local forces as far as protecting armored forces and others. And for medium-range air defense, the HQ-16B, which had a 43-mile range, and the HQ-22 with a 110-mile range, a highly portable, quite long-range air defense artillery system, and as well as the HQ-11 with its LD-3000 close-in weapon system or high-speed Gatling gun and 8 air defense missiles, which could track 32 targets simultaneously with a 19-mile range and 12-mile altitude. This was a very effective weapon, not only against lower flying aircraft, helos, and drones, but also even against munitions such as rocket artillery fire, and even mortars and shells to an extent. This provided excellent force protection for the ground troops. There were also every unit, of course, with every squad right down to the squad level having their own ISR capabilities with their own quadcopter reconnaissance drones. Of course, everybody had a combat data link in terms of even the dismounts with their squad sergeants possessing one, which let the artificial intelligence process the information correctly to avoid friendly fire and to better deploy the troops, as AI played an increasing role in modern warfare, and it cut down on friendly fire incidents drastically to almost none, as well as also the combat data links being steadily updated during the modern fluid battlefield, and the AI allowing commanders to react to the fluid situations more effectively than ever. There was also the Special Operations Brigade of the 77th Group Army, with its Lynx armored all-terrain vehicles, which were slightly smaller than an up-armored Humvee and had an option for armor plating, which they used, and a Tiger MRAP made by Shangji. And these two systems, these two vehicles used by the Special Operations Brigade, were either equipped with a 12.7 millimeter heavy anti-materiel machine gun or a bigger 14.5 millimeter crew serve, which was even more powerful and longer range, and even considered a light air defense machine gun. The maintenance sections of each company possessed the Type 90-II or 2 in Roman numeral armored recovery vehicles, which were newer armored recovery vehicles. Of course, the MV3 FAW fuel trucks, and they had, for the chemical defense forces, a Dongfeng EQ 1125, which was a chemical defense decontamination truck, which had water hoses and a water tank, as well as charcoal foam, as charcoal was an outstanding chemical weapon decontaminant. They also had a new experimental weapon that they could handle, as they were equipped with MOP gear and specially trained to handle dangerous areas and decontaminate areas and troops. And they could safely handle chemicals, including this relatively new chemical weapon concept, which was a drone that carried powdered fent, which of course was a weaponized opioid which could highly eliminate masses of people due to just inhaling just a speck of this dangerous toxic dust to fall asleep and never wake up again. And these drones carried this with special slats to release it as they flew over a group of unwitting enemy forces on the ground, and this weapon would be tested out in a later battle at the Fort Sill battle. But here at the 77th Group Army's other battle at the Sheppard Air Force Base, there would be a very rapid, destructive fight, as both the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade and the 612th, although not the 613th, but the 612th, would fire tactical ballistic missiles at Sheppard, ranging from the DF-4 fired by the 612th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade in Mexico from specially constructed scaffolding, similar to how the North Korean missile program fires their ICBMs. And this intermediate range ballistic missile, there would be 2 of them fired at the installation, carrying each a 2,500-pound munition as a warhead payload, which created an enormous crater. The 616th would fire their DF-15C bunker-busting tactical ballistic missiles with their substantial payloads at concrete reinforced buildings on the post, as well as DF-11As, both of which had roughly a 500-mile range and could hit the installation from where they were in East Texas, outside of Austin. Also, various cruise missiles from the containers, as they would open and fire their salvos, would hit the installation, as the first volley of such missiles to fire all targeted installations first, with other targets taking a back seat, which could even be altered as the combat itself changed on the modern fluid battlefield. Air support in this battle would likewise be large, with an entire bomber squadron of 8 heavy H-6K strategic bombers available, although really only one would be used. They also had a squadron of J-10 fighter jets, which were an outstanding 4th-generation fighter aircraft, as well as the very potent, very destructive JH-7s, which were a ground attack aircraft, which could be used for strike missions and close air support, and carried up to a 20,000-pound payload per aircraft, and could drop a variety of satellite-guided, laser-guided, or even unguided munitions, as well as fire a variety of anti-ship missiles. They could fire air-to-air missiles even for self-defense against enemy fighter jets if they needed to, although they're a ground attack plane, and they could also fire a variety of air-to-ground missiles and had a 23mm nose cannon and were very, very destructive aircraft. There would be one squadron of the JH-7s, one of the J-10 fighters, and a whole H-6K strategic bomber squadron in this area during this battle. Likewise, in the adjacent battle, just slightly to the north in Fort Sill, also covered by the same 77th Group Army, which will be gone over later, which happened at the same time as the Sheppard battle. Air support here would be immense as well. A Russian Su-34 squadron, a ground attack squadron, basically, and an Su-35 squadron, and also a Chinese J-11 squadron as well as the same bomber squadron that was in this area was also used in the Fort Sill area, as well as these bombers eventually carried what amounted in a conventional loadout to a Hiroshima nuke, but in a straight line if all dropped. These were immensely destructive aircraft. Only one of them could level the vast portion of a medium-sized city, especially if flying in a circle and dropping its ordnance. These aircraft would wreak havoc along with all of the artillery from all the various subunits of the 77th Group Army and more. As the battle at Sheppard Air Force Base was a rapid one, it started almost 2 hours into the invasion as the various components that comprise the 77th left their CCP properties from all over this North Texas region and converged on the city of Wichita Falls and Sheppard Air Force Base, as well as Fort Sill. They all left their CCP farms and other properties owned by the CCP regime upon getting their vehicles out of their hidden places and conducting their maintenance and readying them and the troops for the invasion. Breaking out of the CCP regime properties, these forces arrayed themselves all around the city of Wichita Falls, this being roughly only half of the 77th Group Army and its combat capabilities, with the rest of its subunits north in southern Oklahoma preparing to assault Fort Sill with great vigor, like a sledgehammer, just as they were to do to this air base here at Sheppard. As this battle began, the 77th Special Operations Brigade of the 77th Group Army, again, this being an active duty group army on the active duty roster, prepared to rush the installation, as this group army, being an active group army, had gone through the most recent set of reorganization, where the old divisions and specialty brigades and regiments were done away with and now were replaced with mostly combined arms brigades. This 39th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade had 2 tank battalions, and it had an artillery battalion, an air defense battalion, and it had 3 mechanized infantry battalions, as well as a headquarters battalion. The Special Operations Battalion, or brigade, was its own brigade with its ordinary 6 combat battalions and its 1 heavy weapons battalion and headquarters battalion. And the 55th Light Combined Arms Brigade consisted of light infantry, light artillery, and light air defense forces right here, and a headquarters battalion. The 77th Air Defense Artillery Brigade was a air defense artillery brigade with a supply and support battalion, a headquarters battalion, and 6 actual firing air defense battalions, consisting of their closer in HQ-11s, which they had 2 battalions of. They had 2 battalions of their HQ-16Bs, and then they had 2 battalions of HQ-22s, their longest range air defense systems. Their supply and support battalion was a logistical force. The HQ battalion was essentially a support battalion as well, but also administrative over the whole unit. And this was the independent headquarters battalion over the entire group army, which stayed close to the 77th Air Defense Artillery Brigade. Here is the J-10 Squadron, which actually, at the time of the invasion, there were 2 airborne T-38C Talons that were airborne doing a training flight, but were shot down by PL-12 air-to-air missiles by these 2 J-10 fighter aircraft. There's 12 in their squadron here. There's 2 of the H-6Ks and the other 6 up here. They broke off the formation as they're flying still in formation. They broke off and earlier and went this way, and the rest went this way, as they were originally going to head for Sheppard, while the others went to Fort Sill. And here you have the JH-7 Squadron, 12 of them. So these are the J-10s and the JH-7s. And here you have the 139th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade. It's exactly the same structure as the 39th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade. Then, of course, you have the 77th Aviation Brigade, which was, instead of a regiment, it was a whole brigade, and it had 2 attack helicopter battalions, 2 armed reconnaissance helicopter battalions, 2 transport battalions, 1 maintenance battalion, and its headquarters battalion. There's the 40th Mountain Combined Arms Brigade, its headquarters battalion, air defense battalion, 2 light tank battalions, and 3 mechanized infantry battalions and 1 artillery battalion. This was a mountain unit. Also, another mountain unit, the 150th Mountain Combined Arms Brigade. It had its headquarters battalion, air defense battalion, 2 light tank battalions, 3 mechanized infantry battalions, and 1 artillery battalion. These were the forces arrayed within the Wichita Falls area that all emerged from their CCP regime properties, again, most of which being large farm and ranch lands where they had disguised their vehicles beneath specially created camouflage, like those greenhouses, which go on for many meters, rows of them, which could disguise whole battalions, barns, hay bale disguises that they could put their vehicles in a field and cover them with hay. As all of these vehicles were trucked in from nearby ports, it was all done at nighttime, as the Chinese owned the ports, and it was quite easy for them to get their equipment into the ports they owned, as well as putting them on a vehicle, disguising them, and driving them in by truck. Over 2 decades of having time to do this, they easily achieve this goal, driving them deep inland at night from their ports, including ports here in Texas, getting them to their CCP regime properties where they were quickly and aptly disguised to where they could not be seen by land or by air, and hidden away and maintained every so often by the personnel that manned these properties, which were essentially whole units that lived on the properties, and sometimes they were given weekend liberty where they could go out and explore the local towns that they would one day destroy. There were a lot of armed civilians that rose up during this battle in this city, as Wichita Falls itself was a medium-sized city, and it had quite a bit of industry, especially relating to the oil field industry. There were plants that were metal fabrication plants, essentially, that fabricated parts for the oil fields. There was also textile industries in the city, as well as granaries, grain industries, grain storage. Wichita Falls also had a lot of retail going on within it. As it was near a military base, business was good, with a steady income stream from the airmen going and spending their money in the city, as well as the locals coming from towns that were nearby this city, and also the people that lived within it. 5,000 armed civilians rose up and attempted to fight back, but they were quickly crushed by the overwhelming force and firepower and technology possessed by the PLA, especially this being a regular PLA unit. The installation itself, again, the times were desperate, and security measures were attempted insofar as force protection concerns needing to be addressed. And due to force protection concerns over this air installation, an unusual measure was taken where the 434th Field Artillery Brigade sent most of its battalions, although it was a TRADOC training unit. It left a skeleton crew back at Fort Sill, and this unit was equipped with howitzers, mostly M109A6 Paladins, and was sent as a security measure to assist the base security forces in guarding this post, as this installation was nothing more than a chain link fence around an airfield and buildings, much like many other American installations. Due to increasing intelligence reports warning of something imminent as the Sino-Russian naval drills were occurring off both coasts, all the different base commanders could do was take evasive measures in terms of their security and addressing these concerns. And different forces were shuffled around, especially trying to pair Army forces with Air forces to protect these air bases as far as from any type of small attacks. And again, similar to the border situation, the National Guard that was fought along the border in earlier battles explored in this series were put there thinking that this would be some sort of possible attack and not an all-out invasion, thinking that this would be small-scale pinprick-like attacks, and thinking that a show of force, such as putting battalions along the border, would actually make a difference, but it did not, because they were not enough and they were not equipped for such a task as repelling a full-scale invasion. Much was the case here, as the vast majority of this TRADOC unit, minus the drill sergeants and cadre left behind of it at Fort Sill's training areas, these were not enough to take on the forces that were arrayed against them, including a head-on attack by the 77th Special Operations Brigade, which should be heavily assisted by a vast majority of artillery strikes and also missile saturation from these tactical ballistic missiles, as well as cruise missiles by hour number 2, with the YJ-18Cs firing off their missiles in conjunction with the Club K missiles, which were essentially, for all intents and purposes, the same thing. It was very difficult to tell them apart once they were in flight. And they both were fired from the same exact type of container system, a disguise, and they were planted all throughout the country, much like these Trojans. Within the first hour, all of these units had left their CCP regime properties and were moving into position, preparing for a fight. And already within the first hour, as artillery forces set up their batteries from their battalions to fire at all these different points throughout the city, as hostile invader aircraft flew over the skies, with Russian and Chinese refueling aircraft in different areas in order to service these aircraft to keep them in flight longer, along with some being equipped with drop tanks with extra fuel. These aircraft could linger for quite some time and hit their targets effectively and remain for close air support operations, as these mid-air refuelers, in conjunction with the drop tanks, increased the amount of linger time substantially. And these aircraft already had fairly long range to begin with. The aircraft with shorter ranges, such as the MiG-25s and the Q-5s, which were potent but shorter range attack aircraft, were utilized mostly in border areas, as they could quickly do an RTB and get more fuel upon returning to their bases in Mexico, or even Canada, as it related to the northern portion of the invasion. But the deeper inland the invasion was with the Trojan forces, the longer the range of the aircraft that would be operating in these areas. The next video begins with the Battle of Wichita Falls and Sheppard Air Force Base, with the Battle of Eastern Sheppard Air Force Base against elements of the 1st of the 22nd, its headquarters and headquarters battery slightly off the map, as well as base security forces, elements of the 80th and 83rd training wings of the host units on the base, and base security forces. The 77th Special Operations Brigade rushed into the installation, headstrong, with total support from artillery, CH-901A loitering munitions, various tactical ballistic missile and cruise missile strikes, complete and total air support from JH-7 ground attack aircraft, along with a strike on the other side of the installation from the 150th Mountain Combined Arms Brigade and its forces. Even strikes from the A300 300mm rocket artillery systems from over 100 miles away in Oklahoma, fired by the 77th Group Army's Artillery Brigade, manning those systems, as well as FPV drones, robots, quad-legged robots armed with 12.7mm heavy machine guns, and more. Battle of Wichita Falls continues next.